right, picking up with Germany and looking at Russia, and then refocusing attention on England as an alternative. We're going to continue to take a look at our examples of absolutism with Germany, or the creation of the emergence, I guess, of a more formidable German power in Central Europe, Central Western Europe, and then also uh, Peter the Great in Russia, and efforts to, in his eyes, modernize the Russian state and make it more of a presence in the balance of power being wielded or constructed in Europe. And as I said, and then rounding out the dichotomy between absolutism and more maybe constitutional forms of government, or moderate monarchies in Europe. We'll take a look at the Glorious Revolution in England, as I mentioned previously at the outset of the last segment. To start with, though, the Germanic states themselves, after the 30 Years' War, this Germanic principalities were governing themselves essentially, and this numbered some 300 or more provinces and principalities in and around what we know to be Germany today. Again, the construct of the Holy Roman Empire existed as a name, but it was really a name only. That by 1648 and beyond, as we'll see, it's really these strong figures emerging from within these principalities that are going to serve as the formations of more of what we know to be a modern German kind of identity and state organization. That begins with the what's known as the Hohenzollern dynasty. They came to power as early as 1415 in the Principality of Brandenburg in northern central Germany, or what is today northern central Germany. And they grew to dominate the Brandenburg, Prussia provinces in that area. The most notable figure emerging mid 17th century was that of Frederick William, the Great Elector of those provinces, Brandenburg and Prussia. He's notable because he began to organize disparate Hohenzollern lands in those areas around a highly effective standing army. By 1678, by 1678, the army numbered some 40,000 and consumed over 50% of the state's revenues. So again, it's a very costly venture here, but as we'll see, is quite effective. The military bureaucracy began to administer to all functions virtually of civil government. Okay, so this is a uniquely German characteristic, that the civil functions of government and the military functions of government are going to be very closely aligned, and almost indistinguishable in some cases. And it is through that kind of association that Frederick William began to administer authority. To give you an example, the military bureaucracy could levy taxes, and also the landed aristocracy, what was known as the Junkers, served as officers in the army. And this is for Friedrich William, for this Brandenburg Prussian state. It was quite effective. Frederick William needed to control the nobles in order to expand and centralize power. And in return for uh, that, his legitimacy to exact authority and exercise authority over the nobles, he allowed the nobles to again occupy the upper ranks of the military, um, also govern peasants by absolute means, and exempt nobles from paying taxes. So, because the military could raise taxes and basically raise funds, while at the same time the ranking members of the military were exempt from taxes. This is a very beneficial, even though if you were a peasant, perhaps exploitative, kind of structure, it did prove to be quite effective in governing this part of Germany and the Prussian, what would be the Prussian kingdom. As far as economics, Frederick William employed, again, a mercantilist principle, to sound like a broken record here. Uh, he raised high protective tariffs in order to protect Prussian-made goods. He subsidized key sectors of the economy with, again, public funds. He permitted monopolies to manufacture in the areas of manufacturing and in the construction of infrastructure. So literally he is giving a green light here to the tangible effort of state building itself. Now, just prior to the War for Spanish Succession, again that was from 1702 to 1713, in which Brandenburg, Prussia, had answered the call of the Holy Roman Empire to among its principalities to field an army and contribute to the war effort. Frederick William's son, a man by the name of Frederick III, he had come to power in 1688, but in 1701, Frederick III proclaimed himself to be the first king of Prussia, King Frederick I. This marked the ascendance of a new major power within Europe, and it's this kingdom of Prussia that is going to be act as the default power within the vestiges of what was the Holy Roman Empire, and also kind of an anchor in again north central Western Europe, okay, and the precursor to what we know the German state to be today. This emergence of a kind of a Prussian power or presence meant that for Austria and the remnants of that part of the Habsburg Empire, meant that Austria, the Austrian Habsburgs in particular, were kind of at a loss. They'd experienced significant change in diplomacy following the Peace of Westphalia, ending the 30 Years' War. The influence that the Austrian Habsburg dynasty or line of that dynasty had exerted in the Holy Roman Empire was gone. And so as a result, the remnants of that dynasty began to turn their attention towards exacting and exploiting control over southeastern Europe. And that began with Leopold I, who encouraged the spread of influence over the course of his reign. This conflicted with the ambitions, as you might expect, of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks who had laid siege to Vienna in 1683 had been beaten back by a European coalition led by Austrian forces. And in 1699, at the Treaty of Karlowitz, Austrian Habsburgs gained control over what we know today as Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slovenia. So the actual, uh, kind of desires of Leopold I were coming to fruition by late in his reign, in expanding to the southeast of Europe. By the end of the War of Spanish Succession, the Austrian Habsburgs managed again to control or take over the Spanish possessions in the Netherlands, and also those lands and territories, properties in the Italian peninsula as well. Again, it should be noted that it's one thing to take a title to these lands, to have them seen by the other powers of Europe as they're having jurisdiction in these areas, but it is quite another thing to actually physically govern. And already, by this point, the turn of the 17th, 18th century, or yes, 17th, 18th century, um, the Austrian Habsburgs were incapable of projecting their influence that far afield. The empire was multicultural, multinational, and multi-ethnic. Okay? They were suffered from a variety of diverse languages, diverse laws and legal systems. Uh, there was no standardization of governing bodies over these various portions of the what came to be known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was no unified tax code, and of course there was no tangible unitary culture as well. So these are pretty significant challenges that this uh, Austrian Habsburg, Austro-Hungarian state is going to have to deal with, and as a result, because there was no real tangible ties at the lower levels or across these cultures, traditions, in some cases religion, laws, so on and so forth, it became increasingly important for uh, the monarchy, the emperor, to project that sense of unity. That the Habsburg family began to, backed by the military, began to be identified as the sole unifying factor over this vastly diverse population. And perhaps more than most, this is really a perfect example of the precarious kind of nature and that absolutist forms of government have, is that so much emphasis is placed on a centralizing figure that it, instead of in many cases projecting a sense of stability and confidence, it actually is um, ignoring, to its own detriment, the complexities and nuances that are inherent in the governing of expanding kind of and expansive territories, that this Austro-Hungarian kind of state had to deal with. And we're going to see this play out again, continually play out, up until World War One, when in the early 20th century, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire just ceases to exist. It dissolves. So just kind of keep that in mind as far as these kinds of autocratic states that we're talking about here. Another key autocratic power coming to the fore is that of Russia. Now, in previous lectures, I've talked about Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, his becoming the first czar, and how by the early 17th century you have the establishment of the Romanov dynasty, which would last up until again the end of World War One. So I'm not I'm not going to really focus much attention on that development, but instead begin to turn towards the Russian society that we've again kind of covered. This very kind of fixed, rigid social structure that was again hierarchical, autocratic in orientation, um, but also that was and was reminiscent of and parallels very closely kind of the more feudalistic notions of social organization and economics that you can trace back to medieval Western Europe. Um, this begins to change ever so slightly, or it manifests itself in new and different ways with the ascendance of Peter, the first Peter the Great, to power in 1689 as the new head of the Russian state. And very quickly, Peter the Great was an intimidating figure. He stood at about 6'9" tall, and he enjoyed rather crude humor. He was notorious for his poor mannerisms. It's said that in court, among within his court, there were belching contests, crude jokes were exchanged, and there were comical funerals at times. And yet, he had a mean streak to him. He was a fierce disciplinarian. There were records of floggings taking place, impalings, roastings, and beard burnings. So it was a pretty perplexing or head scratching at times within his day-to-day functions of court, you might say. Um, but at the same time, or within this context, he was also enthralled by Western culture and lifestyle and technology. In 1697 and 1698, Peter traveled throughout Western Europe widely. He came back wanting to westernize Russia. He thought that this was the ticket to modernizing the state and its economy. And he believed that with the a concerted attention paid towards technology, that this would be the fastest route really to modernization that would provide Peter with the military he needed to project Russian power as a great power within the European balance of power. Therefore, the army was reorganized to include some Western officers. There was a standing army of some 20,000 that was created. Peasants were conscripted into service for 25-year terms of service. So this was, a lifelong commitment. Peter also built Russia's first navy after his travels to Western Europe, and he did so. He ordered the construction of this navy from scratch. That Russia did not really have a formidable naval force whatsoever prior to this time, the late 17th century, and really into the 18th century before it was deployed. Peter also reorganized the government. In 1711, he created a senate as an administrative body to be to which power would be distributed when Peter was away at war. The affairs of state, however, proved too much for this administrative body, but from within it, uh, there were bureaucratic departments that emerged that would be able to attend to more specific matters of state, things like foreign affairs or war or justice. So that there was some infrastructure, governing infrastructure, upon which Peter could rely. The political geography of Russia began to change roughly about this period of time as well. By 1719, the Russian state consisted of some 50 provinces, which allowed for more effective government to be implemented at a more local level. And in 1722, Peter organized and basically proclaimed a table of ranks, as it was known. This allowed non-nobles to serve in state offices, become part of the bureaucracy, and it even allowed for some, and emphasized some marginal social mobility, that non-nobles could, through the table of ranks, enter into the social ranks of nobility. Civil and military ranks were categorized into 14 various levels. Bureaucrats were to move up these ranks as they moved through their careers. At about the eighth rank, you have this transition from non-nobles could make that jump from their non-noble status to achieving becoming a part of the aristocracy. This was the table of ranks was merit based, and but however, it was abandoned by Peter's successors. So on the one hand, it looks very promising for the Russian state, but unfortunately, because we're talking about the autocratic styles of governing, that meant that it was by the decree and by the will of a single ruler. So you could have these wild swings in policy from one governing emperor to another. As far as public expenses were concerned, the army, the Russian army, and the Russian navy consumed some 80% of the state's annual budget. Again, these are massive sums to be, moving towards or to be allocated for these kinds of functions of state. How did Peter go about raising the funds necessary? Well, again, we have the mercantilist kind of philosophy being implemented in order for the Russian state to bolster its coffers. Peter's going to seek to develop new industries in order to compete with Western markets. He also expanded the extraction of natural resources, things like iron ore, for example, and also he updated the tax code to provide the most expedient way to raise the funds that were necessary. And again, when you're talking about taxes, specifically taxes in an autocratic state under a mercantilist economic philosophy, this is going to put the burden on the lowest ranks of the social order, the peasant classes. And for Russia, that put pressure on the peasants that were already under substantial economic and social pressures that we've seen and discussed earlier. Peter also reconstituted church leadership. He aligned it much more closely to state interests and to bring it under state control. In 1721, Peter abolished the church patriarch, and so, again, that he is dictating terms not only in the affairs of state, but also in the affairs of salvation as well. With special regard to Peter's efforts to westernize Russia, this was really quite universal. First and foremost, it wanted to adopt cultural reforms. There would be no more spitting or scratching on oneself at dinner within the Russian court, among the nobility. Beards would be shaved. Long-skirted coats were shortened. There would be strict enforcement of these cultural codes, all the way to exacting corporal punishment in some cases. Under these kind of cultural norms, women enjoyed greater freedom to an extent. Veils were removed. Upper class Russian women were no longer secluded. They could mix socially with the company of men. They could engage in conversation. They could play and participate in card games and dancing with men. Women could also marry of their own free will. As far as economics are concerned, this was again designed to advance political influence, Russian political influence in Europe, and meeting the needs, creating an economy to meet the needs of expanding security interests. Primary among these was Peter's emphasis on Russia gaining a warm water port. That means essentially that Russia would obtain control of a port city that in which the surrounding waters would not freeze over in the wintertime. And so this was one of Peter's main security concerns. And he set his sights on obtaining access to the Baltic Sea, which was dominated primarily by the Swedish kingdom and its navy. And so this, as you might expect, leads to a kind of a geostrategic gambit on the part of Peter. He looks to crush the Swedes and sees an opportunity when the kingdom falls to Charles the XII, the King of Sweden, who was rather young at the time. It doesn't go well initially. In the year 1700, at the Battle of Narva, a Swedish army of some 8,000 men routs a Russian force numbering some 40,000. So again, it's one thing to want to westernize. It's another thing to actually accomplish it. And so the following year, and over the course of the next 20 years, we have the series of campaigns, what's known as the Great Northern War, between Russia and Sweden, in which Peter is on a very slow, kind of methodical, 2-decade conflict, going to see through C2, basically the expansion of Russian influence to achieve that strategic aim of gaining a warm water port. By 1709, Peter had reorganized his army, again based more on a Western model. It was more thoroughly led by Western officers. And at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Peter defeats Charles's army. By 1721, at the conclusion of the war, the Peace of Nystadt allowed or permitted Peter to gain control of what is today Estonia, Livonia, and Karelia. So he's expanding his physical territory here, and also this really marks the decline of Sweden into more of a second-rate power within Europe. Once this is achieved, once he has access to the Baltic, Peter relocates the Russian capital to what is today known as St. Petersburg, uh, and he creates this city, building it on the in these amidst these swamplands essentially, and it is basically the port city that he called for in a warm water region. That in which he could start to build his and expand his navy. The physical location of St. Petersburg being in the kind of northern section of the Baltic Sea also reinforces his desire to increase Western ties. Um, it's a permanent presence on the Baltic Sea, and it remained the capital of the Russian Empire until 1917. The effects of all these efforts, the effects of all this westernization that was taking place, is important to note. First and foremost, westernization really most directly affected the upper classes, the upper social classes of the Russian aristocracy itself. So there was reform, but it was uneven. Peter imposed Western standards also. It's important to understand. And so the combination of these reforms, the selective beneficiaries and the imposition of these changes, meant that much of society, Russian society, and the masses felt resentful of westernization and of European um, intervention, influence in general. Okay, so we'll stop there briefly. I will come back and talk about, finish out this lecture talking about again the Glorious Revolution in England and its offering of an alternative to these more kind of autocratic styles of order and governance.